Welcome gentlemen, well arrived, please come in. This is likely what the citizens of Alexandria said to Octavian 2053 years ago, when Octavian entered the gates of Alexandria in Egypt and conquered it in the name of the Roman Republic. Now, on this August the 1st, we have to do something that I said we were going to do 3 weeks or so ago before the release of this patch, which was coming back to the predictions I was making before 10.1.5 to see how things have developed, to see how many things were correct about those predictions. We have here our live tier list for the raid, our live tier list for Mythic Plus, and these were the predictions for the DPS specs before 10.1.5 launched. If you're wondering when has Preservation exactly turned into a DPS spec, that's just a stand-in. That's a stand-in for Augmentation, which we can start from quite easily because my prediction for the S tier was going to be Fire, Shadow and Augmentation for Mythic Plus, and it turned out to be quite correct. They are also quite strong at the same time in the raid, so it was a quite easy guess to go for S tier for these specs. I was quite certain of Shadow and I was quite certain of Augmentation. I wasn't certain whatsoever about Mages because Mages were going through a rework, and Blizzard was also quite often balancing the spec in the PTR together with Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin and Fire Mage were the two specs receiving more often changes, so it was more risky to guess Fire Mage, but I'm happy I guessed it correctly. Also, the other mages were guessed in these positions. The logic behind this was that in Mythic Plus, Frost was obviously going to be better than Arcane, and in the raid, it was going to be worse than Arcane. But there is a problem. In Mythic Plus, it wasn't going to matter because everyone was going to be playing Fire anyways. So even if Frost is better, Fire was still going to be the one spec that was being played. So Arcane was going to find more room in the raid to be played compared to Frost. That was mostly the reasoning as to why I put them here. I like to believe I was correct on that choice. I also stand by my decision once more to keep Red Paladin in the S tier. Red Paladin is definitely not S tier when it comes to the raid, and also, you know, amongst the better ones in Mythic Plus, but then again, we have all seen the current state of Mythic Plus. Mostly it was because of the popularity. You know, the name comes by itself. Flavor of the month, you know, when you are 1 in 4 of every single melee DPS choice to be played, you are de facto a flavor of the month spec. The popularity is very, very high. That's mostly why I kept Red Paladin there, even though they weren't going to become any more powerful in this patch, just out of the sheer popularity of the spec. And to reiterate, even in the raid, where they are doing, you know, quite badly, when it comes to popularity, there you go. Red Paladin is second. That, I think, still counts to be considered a flavor of the month spec. What I would count as my first mistake would be Demo. As you see here, Unholy is in the middle of the pack. Players were definitely not going to laugh at you for playing Unholy, and I was quite certain of Unholy in my chance to happen of the prediction. I was quite certain of this. The reason for that, of course, was because of their power in the raid. Unholy right now is doing quite well. They are quite powerful in the raid, as you can see here. So I was like, well, I also know they are shit in Mythic Plus. I also know they are a tragedy. So if they are tragedy in Mythic Plus and very good in the raid, what's the average? The average is the middle. That is a sound logic for Unholy. However, Demo is also great in the raid and also bad in Mythic Plus. So why are they S tier? You know, why are they so high if they are basically the ranged version of Unholy? Even down to what they require, like for example getting Power Infusion or getting Augmentation Evoker buffs. They are basically the same profile of Unholy, yet they are much farther apart in this prediction. So that's the first mistake, I would say. Demo should have probably gone down closer to Unholy Death Knight. Let's also get rid of the bottom 2 rows, you know. The village clowns were going to be Feral, Assassination and Survival. So in Mythic Plus, Assassination, Feral and Survival are quite low. In the raid, Assassination, Feral and Survival are also very low. Pretty consistent with the guess. I was also quite certain that these specs were going to remain this underplayed and unpopular, so I'm gonna go 100% success chance in guessing the bottom tier of the meta. The one above, we have Frost, Marksmanship, Windwalker, Outlaw and Elemental. You know, once more for the melee you have Frost and then Outlaw and then Windwalker. Outlaw, Frost, Windwalker amongst the weakest in the raid, and then you have Outlaw, Frost, and Windwalker in Mythic Plus as well, not being nearly as strong. If you go back in the raid, you can see Assassination is at the bottom, Survival, Outlaw are towards the bottom, Feral Druid is also in the bottom half, with Marksmanship and Elemental. Marksmanship is also amongst the bottom half performance. Elemental is doing slightly better, but once you go in Mythic Plus, Elemental is also not doing nearly as well, together with Marksmanship Hunter. So I think these two bottom rows are quite consistent with what we have seen. These specs did not really receive that many changes or changes at all in 10.1.5, so if they were here before the patch, it was likely they were going to continue staying here after the patch. So I would like to give myself a 100% success chance in predicting these two rows. Maybe Elemental for being slightly better in the raid than the other specs, could have gone higher up, but you know, it's still so just generally unpopular, you know, generally niche, that I think they deserve to stay in. Maybe they will laugh behind your back. Then we have the middle tiers. The middle tiers, this one, as we pointed out, I think Unholy was already the correct choice to be in here. Then we have Beast Mastery, Frost, Affliction, and Arms. So the reason for this is that I was hopeful, even though I wasn't certain whatsoever, I was hopeful that the buffs of Affliction were going to make the spec definitely stronger than their previous version, and it happened. You know, Affliction now is a more viable, definitely much more competitive than before spec in the raid. So that alone deserves to have the spec raised one or a couple of tiers compared to their bottom situation of before. They have moved to a much more competitive situation now in the raid. Sure, in Mythic Plus they are still shit, but that's similar to Unholy, so they get to be more or less in the same ranking. Frost Mage is similar. Frost Mage is also now doing much better in the raid and is still a strong spec in Mythic Plus. Once more, yes, they are being overshadowed by Fire, but they still remain a competitive spec in Mythic Plus, so they also deserve to be more or less here. The ones that I would likely count as a mistake are Arms and Beast Mastery. That's because after the patch, Beast Mastery has not been doing better whatsoever in the raid. They are in fact still one of the worst performers, still beaten by Marksmanship, for example, and in Mythic Plus, they are not doing that well either. You know, yes, they have surpassed Marksmanship in 20 and high up keys. Of course, in 25 plus it becomes a little bit embarrassing, but we knew this already, right? So I don't think it warrants them being into the mid tier. I think they should have gone lower down, perhaps swapped with Elemental, maybe. Arms is a similar situation. My initial justification for putting Arms here and Fury here was that in Mythic Plus, Fury is much more popular, but in the raid, Arms was outperforming Fury Warrior. But it's not by much, it's quite a narrow margin in terms of performance anyways, and then in Mythic Plus, Fury is much better than Arms, so perhaps, maybe, Arms also should have went down one tier together with BM. Those are the first two here I would consider not quite accurate. Then we have perhaps the more difficult one to gauge, which is the A tier, the one right below the S tier, the ones that are not going to be flavor of the month, they're not going to be super powerful, but still definitely, you know, serious people are going to be here, players who want to compete one way or another. We see some reasonable choices, like the first three or even the first four I would put here quite easily. Havoc, Balance, Devastation, and Arcane. You know, Havoc, even though they are, you know, middling in Mythic Plus and their performance is still middling in the raid, they are still one of the more requested picks in the raid due to their debuff and Vengeance not being a popular tank in the raid, so it's quite a requested spec. Same goes for Balance. Balance remains one of the top popular specs in the raid, and even in Mythic Plus, amongst the dominance of the Exodia comp, they are one of the few choices at very high keys when we go into this piece right here. Still, despite this horror show, they at least exist. They at least have a room to play. And then Devastation also, they have lost much more because they are rerolling to Augmentation, but at least they still have some power in the raid. Yes, it's also falling down quite a bit compared to their top tier of before, but that's not really because of the 10.1.5 changes. It mostly has to do with many of the best Devastation evokers moving to Augmentation. That's mostly just it. I still consider it quite the competitive spec. So I still think they should stay in here. And then Arcane, as I said, it was mostly here because of the raid performance. We know the Mythic Plus performance is weaker and also weaker than Frost, but I think in the raid they are more valuable. Still though, I think it still could have ended up close to tied to Frost in the middle. Overall, it's definitely not nearly as much of a safe choice in this tier compared to, for example, to the first 2 or 3 of the specs. Then we have Subtlety, Enhancement, Fury, and Destruction. So Fury is self-explanatory. They are doing quite well in Mythic Plus, all things considered, and in the raid they are still doing all right. Same goes for Enhancement. Enhancement is still one of the strongest specs in the raid when it comes to melee, and still one of the strongest specs in Mythic Plus when it comes to melee. The only reason why they aren't S tier is because of how much this is dominating. Otherwise, they would have entered the S tier. Subtlety is also somewhat similar. Subtlety is also doing all right in the raid. It's the only of the rogue specs that's doing all right in the raid, and in Mythic Plus they continue to be a strong spec. It just doesn't show in super high keys because of this, right? But otherwise they are still quite the competitive spec, so it's also an easy pick together with Enhancement and Fury. Destruction is perhaps one of the mistakes of the season, because even after the changes in 10.1.5 to Warlocks in Mythic Plus, they remained quite weak. Yes, they ended up being the more popular and stronger one of the Warlocks, and in the raid they still lag far behind Demo, so it definitely doesn't quite justify them being so high. I think they are much closer to Affliction, right, where Affliction is very high in the raid, Destro is much weaker, and in Mythic Plus they are stronger but not by much, and even if they are stronger there is still quite a massive gap to the strongest of these specs. So in terms of mistakes in here, I would say Demo should have gone closer to Unholy, perhaps even up 1 tier, and then Destruction should have gone at least 1 tier below, possibly even Arcane, Arms, and BM. So I would say 5 of the picks were misplaced in terms of the predictions of 10.1.5 when it comes to the power of the DPS specs. So we're talking about 5 out of 26. So roughly a 75% success chance in predicting the strongest specs in this patch. Technically, we also have one about tanks and healers to be talking about, although that one is much more straightforward. You know, the whole question about this meta was what was going to happen with Guardian and with Holy Paladin, and the rest wasn't really going to change much. So picks like Mistweaver and Discipline and Prot Warrior staying in the bottom, losing S tier popularity when it came to Prot Paladin and Resto Shaman because they were being, you know, outdone by other specs was also quite obvious. Brewmaster staying middle of the pack with Blood Death Knight being a little bit more popular overall. Those were all pretty easy things to guess and to predict. The most of the challenging picks was Guardian Druid going to be better than Vengeance or not? And was Holy Paladin, after the rework, going to become Flavor of the Month? Basically, all of this ended up being correct with the exemption of Guardian. As I said, if you are 6 months copium free, Guardian was going to be here. If you are a copium enjoyer, Guardian was going to be in the S tier and Vengeance was going down in the meta tier. So overall, I would say perhaps one mistake, one swap of these 2 specs, and it was going to be quite the correct prediction for tanks and healers, which is still higher percentage of guessing compared to the DPS. That being said, also, guessing DPS specs is much more challenging. It's much harder. You also have to have often a much bigger difference between Mythic Plus and the raid when it comes to DPS. For example, for tanks, just to name one, is much less relevant how powerful they are in the raid. It's not nearly as impactful, right, compared to DPS specs. So the DPS were quite more challenging to guess, but I would say a 75-ish% chance of having guessed correctly their meta right now is satisfying enough for me. Let me guys know, of course, if you have guessed any of these picks yourself, and or if you were blatantly wrong in guessing some of the specs, if you took some major blindsides with some of these picks. Besides this, on this Guessing Tuesday, we are done for today. So thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel. You can still support in plenty of free ways. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, Oh, it's late. It's late. I started late. I finished late. I have to do like 2 hours of things in 40 minutes. I have to speed up.